Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This one was basically just a pure fan fiction dream of myself. Like, I wanted to see what would happen if Cain magically came back with the help of the orcs, of course. So I hope you're gonna enjoy it as much as I did. And if you do, just like, share, and subscribe, and just leave a comment somewhere. Have a good one.
The biggest comeback, being an extract from the personal memoirs of Ciaphas Cain, hero of the Imperium deceased, formerly deceased. It's complicated. Edited, annotated, and presented by Inquisitor Amberly Vale, Ordo. The effing about hummies is most of 'em ain't worth the bother, but every now and then you get one Watt's proper killy. The kind Watt makes you boys think twice before charging, which is saying something 'cause most of 'em can't think once. De say hummies is valuable, see, they make the wag, better just by bane dare to fight. And if one of 'em goes and dies on you before you's had a proper go, well, that's just wasteful, innit? War Gut Smasher, a tactical assessment compiled by the Ordo Xenos. Translated from phonetic orcoid vocalization. Accuracy approximate at best. Chapter 1, The Plan. The camp of Warboss Gutsmasha sprawled across what had once been an imperial agri-settlement on the contested world of Calyx Roman 4 like a wound that had been left to fester, and then decorated with scrap metal. Crude shelters of corrugated plasteel and flattened fuel drums leaned against each other in defiance of structural engineering, acoustics, and basic hygiene. The air tasted of promethium fumes, roasting squig flesh, and the unmistakable musk of several thousand orcs who had never once in their fungoid lives considered the concept of bathing. Smoke from a dozen cook fires tangled with the greenish haze that always seemed to hang over large orc encampments. A visible manifestation, some Ordo Xenos scholars theorized, of the ambient psychic field generated by the Greenskin Collective. Gretchen scurried between the legs of hulking boys, dodging casual kicks and the occasional thrown wrench. Somewhere in the distance, two orcs were settling a disagreement about whose turn it was to use the big shooter by hitting each other with it. In the center of this symphony of chaos stood the largest structure in the camp, Gutsmash's personal fort, a three-story edifice of welded tank hulls and cathedral stonework that had been looted from an ecclesiarchy shrine. A crude but recognizable orcish glyph had been painted over the imperial aquila in lurid red, and a banner made from what appeared to be an entire chimera's hull plating flapped lazily from the highest point, bearing Gutsmash's personal symbol, a grinning orc face with a human skull in its teeth. Inside, the warboss held court. Gutsmasha was enormous even by orc standards, nearly 3 meters of scarred green muscle, draped in a patchwork of looted imperial officers' coats that had been crudely stitched together into something approaching a greatcoat. His jaw was a masterwork of the Painboy's art, half replaced with a steel prosthetic that clicked and whirred when he spoke. His eyes, small and red and startlingly shrewd, swept across his inner circle with the calculating intelligence that had made him the most dangerous orc on Calyx Roman 4. Right then, Gutsmasher said, his voice a tectonic rumble that rattled the teeth in the skulls nailed to the walls. Listen up, you gits, 'cause I's only gonna say dis once, probably twice, maybe 3 times 'cause you lot is thick. His inner circle shuffled. Weirdboy Zapchit, a hunched, twitching orc with eyes that glowed faintly green and a staff topped with a cage containing something that sparked and screamed, scratched at the crude copper wiring bolted into his skull. Mechboy Boltscab, whose entire right arm had been replaced with a bewildering array of tools, drills, and at least one thing that was probably a weapon, adjusted his goggles and belched. Painboy Stitchgrot, wearing a blood-stained leather apron and an expression of permanent, gleeful curiosity, was absently sharpening a bone saw on his own tusk. "I's been thinkin'," Gutsmasher began. "That's dangerous, dat is," Boltskeb muttered. Gutsmasher's backhand sent him sprawling across the room and into a pile of looted ammunition crates. He picked himself up, apparently undamaged. "Good point, boss, carry on." "I's been thinkin'," Gutsmasher continued, about the best fights, the really good ones. The kind what makes you feel alive, you know, when you finds a humy what's actually worth crumpin'. The assembled orcs nodded with uncharacteristic solemnity. For an orc, a truly worthy opponent was something approaching a religious experience. And I keeps hearin' stories, don't I? From the old boys, from the ones what fought on Perlia and Gravelax and all dem other places. Stories about one humy. One puny, skinny, pointy-at-wearin' humy what killed more of the boys than any other git in the whole galaxy. "The Commissar," Zapchit whispered, and the green glow in his eyes flared. Around the room, orcs shifted. Not with fear, orcs didn't really do fear, but with something that might have been its nearest equivalent, respect. "The Commissar," Gutsmasher confirmed. "Cain, they called him. And every orc what ever fought him says the same effing he was the best, the fastest, the most cunnin'. He'd look at you with dem cold, humy eyes and you knew you was in for a proper scrap." "But he's dead, boss," Stichgrot pointed out with the air of someone raising a minor technical objection. "'Eard he died in his bed, of bane old, which is," he added with genuine disgust, "just wrong." "That's the point," Gutsmasher roared, slamming his power claw into the table and splitting it clean in half. A Gretchen who had been hiding underneath it fled shrieking. "The greatest fighter the hummies ever 'ad, and he dies of bane old, without a proper fight, without me gettin' a go. It ain't right, it ain't orky." He leaned forward, and his steel jaw clicked into a terrible grin. "So where's gonna bring him back?" Silence. Then Boldskeb, who had clambered back to his position, raised a wrench-tipped finger. "Boss, that's, how do I put this, completely impossible." "Is it though?" Gutsmasher turned to Zapchit. "Tell him what you told me." The weird boy's eyes blazed, his staff crackled, the cage thing screamed louder. "I can feel him," Zapchit hissed, his voice layered with harmonic distortion that made the air taste of copper. "In the Wayag, he's in Dara. All dem boys what fought him, all dem boys what feared him, they left a mark, see, a shape, like the hole left when you pulls a tooth out. The Commissar is remembered, boss. And in the Wayag, rememberin' is real." "But we need something to stick him to," Boltskeb said, his mechboy's brain already churning despite his better judgment. An anchor, something from the Humy himself. Bits. DNA the hummies call it. Without dat, we's just pullin' green smoke out of the warp, and that's how you gets demons, and I hates demons." "So where do we get the Commissar's bits?" Gutsmasher asked, already knowing the answer. "The Humy school," Stichgrot said, grinning. "He taught Dara, didn't he? Hummies is sentimental gits. Dale Ave kept something." Gutsmasher straightened to his full height. The looted officer's coat strained across his massive shoulders. "Right. Boldskeb, you builds me a machine, the best machine you ever built, a resurrection machine. Zapchit, you gets ready to do your weird stuff. Stichgrot, you prepares the operatin' table." His red eyes gleamed. "And I's gonna send the Blood Axe commandos to get the bits." "The commandos," Boldskeb said doubtfully. "Boss, they ain't exactly subtle." "Dara the sneakiest gits we got," Gutsmasher bellowed. "Now get movin', all of you. We's gonna have the best scrap the galaxy's ever seen." The boys cheered. The walls shook. A Gretchen fell off a rafter and landed in the squig pot. Somewhere in the warp, a psychic echo that tasted of Tana tea and polished boots flickered in response to the focused belief of several thousand orcs who had just decided, with absolute and unshakable conviction, that a dead man was going to live again. Reality, as it always did around orcs, took note. Chapter 2: The Heist. The Scola Progenium facility on Coriolis Roman 7 was a somber, granite-faced institution that had been producing commissars, storm troopers, and administratum clerks for the better part of 3 millennia. Its halls smelled of chalk dust and discipline. Its corridors were lined with portraits of distinguished alumni, and in the central hall of honors, a particularly large painting depicted Commissar Ciaphas Cain, hero of the Imperium, twice decorated, savior of approximately a dozen worlds, in a suitably heroic pose that bore, according to those who had known him, only a passing resemblance to the actual man. Beneath the painting, in a sealed reliquary case of blessed glass, sat a single item, Cain's old commissarial sash, stained with what the accompanying plaque assured visitors was his blood, shed in valorous combat against the enemies of mankind. A lock of hair, gray with age, had been pressed under glass beside it, donated, the records claimed, during his tenure as a tutor at the facility. It was 3 hours past midnight when the commandos arrived. Commando Nob Sneakjit had painted himself purple. He had painted his entire squad purple. He had painted their weapons purple. He had, in a fit of thoroughness that surprised even himself, painted the truck purple, though this had not prevented it from being clearly audible from approximately 2 kilometers away as it roared across the Skola's ornamental gardens, crushing a memorial topiary of Lord Commander Solar Macharius Flat. Purple is the sneakiest color, Sneakjit reminded his boys as they dismounted in a clattering avalanche of poorly maintained wargear. "'Cause nobody's ever seen a purple orc." "That's 'cause Dara ain't no purple orcs, boss," said Commando Grickfang, who was occasionally troubled by logic. "Exactly," Sneakjit hissed triumphantly. "'Ow can you see something what don't exist? Now shut your gob and be sneaky." Being sneaky, in commando terms, meant moving at a slightly slower pace than a full charge and only shouting at half volume. They approached the Skola's eastern wall, a 3-meter barrier of reinforced rockcrete, and Sneakjit surveyed it with a critical eye. "Right, there is a gate about 50 meters that way." "Wahag!" screamed Commando Grotzmak, who had already detonated a stick bomb against the wall. Rockcrete fragments showered the squad. A section of wall roughly 4 meters wide collapsed inward, taking a decorative flying buttress and part of a cloister with it. Sneakjit stared at the hole. He stared at Grotzmak. He hit Grotzmak. "What did I say about Bane sneaky?" "Sorry, boss, got excited." They poured through the breach and into the cloister, where an elderly drill abbot, roused by the explosion, emerged from his quarters in a nightshirt and immediately fainted. 2 commandos tripped over him. A third stepped on a Gretchen that had been sent ahead as a scout and was now running in panic circles. "Which way is the vault?" Sneakjit demanded, consulting a map that had been drawn in squig blood on the back of a looted ration pack. He held it upside down, then sideways, then ate a corner of it by accident. "I think it's this way, boss." They went that way. It was not that way. They ended up in the refectory, where Commando Ugbash ate an entire month's supply of processed nutri-paste before anyone could stop him, and then in the dormitories, where 40 juvenile progena woke to the sight of purple-painted orcs arguing in stage whispers about cartography, and began screaming with an enthusiasm that rivaled the orcs themselves. "Dat way!" Sneakjit roared, abandoning all pretense of stealth, and the squad thundered through 3 more walls that, it should be noted, had perfectly functional doors before arriving in the Hall of Honors. The reliquary case gleamed in the emergency lighting that was now strobing throughout the facility. Alarms blared. Somewhere, a Skola security detail was mobilizing, though they would arrive too late to do anything but catalog the damage. Sneakjit stared at the painting of Cain. Cain's painted eyes stared back, frozen in an expression of heroic determination that, had the subject been present to comment, he would probably have described as hopelessly idealized. "That's him," Sneakjit breathed, "de commissar." He smashed the reliquary with the butt of his slugga, swept the sash and the pressed hair into a bag made from a Gretchen's loincloth, the Gretchen in question protesting bitterly, and turned to his boys. "Right, lads, we got what we came for, leg it." They legged it. They legged it through the Skola's chapel, its library significant fire damage, its gymnasium moderate structural damage, and its senior faculty lounge 1 broken window, 2 broken chairs, and a traumatized servitor. They legged it back to the truck, which Grotzmek had somehow set on fire in their absence, and they legged it into the night, howling with triumph, leaving behind a Scola progenium that looked as if it had been visited by a small, localized, and deeply confused apocalypse. The Scola's headmistress, surveying the damage at dawn, would later file a report with the administratum that concluded, the facility was infiltrated by an unknown Xenos force of considerable size but questionable competence. Casualties, one fainting, several cases of juvenile hysteria, and the complete destruction of the memorial topiary. Strategic losses, one reliquary containing personal effects of Commissar Ciaphas Cain deceased. Recommend increased perimeter security and a thorough review of our threat assessment protocols, as we had not previously considered the possibility of an Orc burglary. Chapter 3: The Surgery. The Resurrection machine occupied the entirety of what had once been a Prometheum refinery's main processing hall. Mechbo Boldskeb had spent 3 weeks building it, which by Orc engineering standards constituted a lifetime of careful, methodical craftsmanship. It was a thing of terrible beauty, if your aesthetic sensibilities ran toward the nightmarish. A central chamber, salvaged from the cockpit of a downed Imperial Valkyrie, sat at the heart of the device, surrounded by a web of cables, pipes, and conduits that connected it to no fewer than 6 looted plasma generators, a bank of cogitator units that had been persuaded to cooperate through the application of hammers and threats, and a towering spire of copper and iron that Boldskeb called the Wayog antenna, and which crackled with green energy even when the machine was nominally off. Orc glyphs had been daubed on every surface in red paint, not for decoration, but because Boldskeb firmly believed that the glyphs helped things work. Given the nature of Orc technology, he was probably right. The operating table, Painboy Stitchgrot's contribution, was a slab of hull plating from a lemon rust battle tank, set at a slight angle and equipped with restraints made from tank tracks. It was, Stitchgrot assured everyone, dead comfy. It was stained with substances that defied chemical analysis. The gathered boys filled the refinery to capacity, 500 Orcs, packed shoulder to massive shoulder, their breath fogging in the cold air, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. The smell was indescribable in any language, including Low Gothic, which had a surprisingly extensive vocabulary for unpleasant odors. Gutsmasher stood at the front, arms crossed, watching with the intensity of a war boss who had staked his reputation, and therefore his life, on this working. Right, Boldskeb said, wiping his hands on a rag that was dirtier than his hands. The bits go in air. He opened a compartment in the central chamber, revealing a nest of wires and something that looked disturbingly like a mechanical stomach. The Gretchen's loincloth bag was appended into it, the sash, the pressed hair, flakes of ancient blood. The compartment closed with a hiss of hydraulics and a belch of green steam. Zapchit, Gutsmasher said, do ya effing. The weird boy stepped forward. He was twitching worse than usual, his eyes blazing with emerald fire, the staff in his hands humming at a frequency that made teeth ache and vision blur. The caged creature atop it had gone silent, curled into a ball of terrified luminescence. I can feel him, Zapchit whispered, then louder, I can feel I am. Ez in de Wayag, boys, the commissar, all of you what remembers, all of you what believes, give it to me. The boys began to chant. It started as a low rumble felt more than heard, vibrating through the floor and up through the bones. Wahag, wahag, wahag. Each repetition was louder, harder, more forceful. The air thickened. The green haze intensified, coalescing around the machine, around Zapchit, around the chamber where a dead man's DNA waited for something that no rational science could explain. Zapchit screamed. Green lightning erupted from his staff, arcing into the Wayog antenna, cascading down through the web of cables and pipes. The plasma generators roared to full power. The cogitator units shrieked in digital protest, their screens displaying cascading errors in 3 languages before settling on a single Orcish glyph that roughly translated to doing it. The central chamber blazed with light, not the clean light of Imperial technology, but the raw, green, howling light of the Wayag. Field given physical form. The smell hit next. Ozone first, sharp and electric, the smell of reality being forcibly rewritten. Then something organic, something wet and warm and growing. The smell of flesh forming around bone, of lungs inflating for the first time, of a heart beginning to beat in a chest that hadn't existed 30 seconds ago. It was the smell of life being brute-forced into existence by the collective psychic will of 500 orcs who simply refused to accept that what they wanted was impossible. Bones cracked into place with sounds like gunshots. Muscles wove themselves over them in glistening sheets. Skin spread like water over a surface, finding its shape, finding its form. The orcs didn't know what Cain looked like old. They remembered him young, strong and tall, sharp-eyed, quick on his feet. And so the Wayag, field drawing on 1,000 battle memories, 1,000 moments of dat git nearly got me, built him young. The light died. The generators wound down with a descending whine. Zapchit collapsed, smoking faintly, and was dragged away by 2 Gretchen. The chamber hissed open. On the operating table, a man lay. Tall, dark-haired. The face that had stared from 1,000 recruitment posters, that had been carved in stone on a dozen worlds, that had been the last thing more orcs had seen than any other human face in Imperial history. He was breathing. 500 orcs held their breath, a biological event unprecedented in recorded xenological history. His eyes opened. Wahag! The roar shook the refinery to its foundations. Orcs hammered their weapons against their chests, against each other, against anything within reach. Gutsmash's steel jaw stretched into the widest grin it had ever produced, servos whining with the strain. "De Commissar is back, boys," the warboss bellowed. "Now wes gonna ave de greatest fight ever." On the table, Ciaphas Cain, hero of the Imperium, formerly deceased, currently naked and profoundly confused, stared up at 500 celebrating orcs and wondered, with the crystal clarity of a man whose survival instincts were already running at full capacity, how he was going to get out of this one. Chapter 4. An Unexpected Awakening. I should like to state, for the record, that dying had been one of the very few experiences in my long and ludicrously over-decorated career that I had actually managed to do properly, peacefully, in bed, with clean sheets and a cup of Tana tea on the nightstand. After a lifetime of being shot at, stabbed, clawed, bitten, exploded, frozen, possessed, and once memorably sat on by a chaos spawn, I had managed the singular achievement of expiring from natural causes, surrounded by people who were not actively trying to kill me. I had rather hoped that death would be the one duty I could discharge, without anyone expecting me to do it again. I was wrong. Amberly Vale's editorial note. Cain's characteristic self-deprecation is on full display from the very first lines of this account. I should note that peacefully is doing considerable heavy lifting in his description. His final years were spent as an advisor to Lord General Zyvan, and involved rather more strategic-level warfare than a truly peaceful retirement might suggest. He also omits the fact that his passing was mourned across multiple sectors, and that no fewer than 3 worlds declared days of remembrance. But then, acknowledging the genuine affection in which he was held has never been Cain's strong suit. The first thing I became aware of was the smell. If you have never had the singular misfortune of waking up inside an orc encampment, I can only say that the experience defies linguistic description in much the same way that a supernova defies a parasol. The closest approximation I can offer is, imagine the combined effluvia of an abattoir, a promethium refinery, and a fungal cave, all filtered through the body odor of several hundred beings who had never encountered the concept of soap. Now imagine that smell has texture. You are approximately halfway there. The second thing I became aware of was the noise. Orcs are, by nature, loud. 500 orcs in a state of celebration are a phenomenon that technically qualifies as a localized natural disaster. The chanting, wahag, Wagog, wagog, hit my newly formed eardrums like a series of artillery impacts and made coherent thought a rather ambitious goal. The third thing I became aware of, and this was the one that really crystallized the situation, was the faces. Green, massive, tusked, grinning with a delight that was, under the circumstances, deeply and fundamentally terrifying. My survival instincts, Emperor bless them, were already operational before my higher cognitive functions had finished booting up. Within approximately 2 seconds of opening my eyes, I had cataloged the following. I was on a metal slab. I was unclothed. I was surrounded by orcs. I had no weapons. The nearest exit was approximately 40 meters away, through a crowd of ecstatic greenskins. I was, in the most comprehensive and unambiguous sense of the term, in trouble. "As awake," bellowed the largest orc I had ever seen, and I had seen more than my fair share, stepping forward with a grin that displayed enough metal dentistry to build a small shuttle. "As actually awake. Told you gets it'd work." I sat up. This was a mistake, as it made the room spin and brought the smell into sharper focus, but remaining horizontal in a room full of orcs felt like an even worse option. My body felt strange, too light, too responsive. My hands, when I looked at them, were unlined. Young. I filed this observation under things to panic about later and focused on the immediate crisis. "Welcome back, Commissar," the enormous orc continued, spreading his arms wide in what I think was meant to be a welcoming gesture, but which, given the power claw on his left hand, looked more like an industrial accident waiting to happen. "I's gut smasher, and you is de reason where's all air." "How delightful," I managed, in a voice that sounded unfamiliar, younger, stronger, but still recognizably mine. "And what reason would that be?" Gutsmash's grin widened to proportions that should not have been anatomically possible. "We brought you back, didn't we? From de dead. 'Cause you is de best fighter de hummies ever 'ad, and you died without givin' us a proper scrap, and dat ain't on." My mind, which had been sifting through possible explanations at a speed born of decades of practice, settled on the most probable one with the reluctant certainty of a man identifying a familiar disease. The Wahog field. I had encountered orc psychic phenomena before. Their technology worked because they collectively believed it should. Their vehicles moved because enough orcs were convinced that red ones went faster. If enough orcs believed strongly enough that a dead commissar could be brought back to life. Emperor's teeth, they had actually done it. "You brought me back from the dead," I said, keeping my voice level through an act of will that deserved a commendation in itself, "so that you could fight me." "Not just fight ya," Gutsmasher looked almost offended. "Gonna ave de greatest battle ever. You and de hummies on one side, us boys on de other, and wes gonna see was de best. Proper, orky, warfare." Each word was punctuated by a slam of his power claw against his chest that sent shockwaves through the floor. The boys cheered. I smiled. It was the smile I had perfected over a century of commissarial service, the one that suggested calm authority and quiet confidence. Behind it, my brain was running escape calculations so fast I'm surprised my skull didn't overheat. "Well," I said, swinging my legs off the table and trying to look as though standing up naked in an orc workshop was exactly how I had planned to spend my afterlife. "If we're going to do this properly, I'm going to need some time to prepare. Get ready for the big fight, as it were." This was, of course, pure fabrication. What I actually needed was time to find clothing, a weapon, and a way out. But orcs, for all their cunning, have a cultural blind spot a Baneblade could drive through. They understand the concept of a worthy opponent preparing for battle. It's sporting. It's orky. Gutsmasher nodded with the solemnity of a war boss granting a boon to a respected foe. "Right. Ya eared de commissar. Get him some gear. And someone get him something to eat, as probably ungry after Bane dead and all." Amberley Vale's editorial note: the mechanism by which the orcs achieved Cain's resurrection, effectively using the psychic gestalt field of the Wahog. To reconstitute a physical being from genetic material and collective memory is, to the best of the Ordo Xenos' understanding, theoretically consistent with observed properties of orchid psychic phenomena. The WAHOG field has been documented bending causality, thermodynamics, and basic engineering principles. Resurrection, while unprecedented in recorded encounters, represents a difference of degree rather than kind. I should also note that Cain is characteristically underselling his composure in this passage. To wake naked and unarmed among hundreds of orcs and immediately begin manipulating their cultural expectations is not the act of a man driven purely by cowardice, whatever he might claim. I was given clothing orc-sized, which meant I was essentially wearing a tent and a bowl of something that I chose not to examine too closely but which tasted, against all probability, not entirely unlike grok stew. I ate it. When one has been dead, one's standards regarding cuisine undergo a certain recalibration. And I began to plan. Chapter 5. The Inquisitor's Attention. What I did not know at the time, and would only learn considerably later, during the kind of debrief that involves a great deal of recaf and even more disbelief, was that my resurrection had not gone unnoticed by the Imperium's more attentive organs. Inquisitor Amberly Vale of the Ordo Xenos received the report from Coriolis Roman 7 within 6 hours of the Scola break-in. As the editor of my memoirs and my closest, as someone who had known me for a very long time, she was flagged automatically whenever anything involving my name crossed inquisitorial channels. She read the report. She read it again. Then she sat very still for approximately 90 seconds, which, for a woman who had stared down Tyrannid hive tyrants and chaos sorcerers without flinching, was the equivalent of anyone else having a complete emotional collapse. The report was clear enough. Orc infiltrators, blood axe commandos, judging by the paint residue, had broken into the Scola progenium and stolen personal effects belonging to the late Commissar Ciaphas Cain. Specifically, they had taken biological material, a lock of hair, blood-stained fabric, DNA. Amberly was, above all things, an inquisitor. Her mind went first to threat assessment. Orc weirdboys were known to use biological material as foci for psychic attacks. An orc warband with the DNA of the Imperium's most celebrated commissar could theoretically use it to disrupt morale operations, to psychically interfere with Imperial command structures that still invoked Cain's name as a rallying point. It was a weapon. She mobilized accordingly. But beneath the professional calculus, in a place she rarely acknowledged and never discussed, something else stirred. Something that was neither tactical nor analytical. Something that looked a great deal like hope, which was an emotion that Amberly Vale, who had seen what the galaxy did to hope, tried very hard not to indulge. Amberly Vale's editorial note. I will confine my remarks here to noting that the investigation was of considerable strategic importance, given the potential for orc exploitation of recovered genetic material. I found the case personally significant, though the reasons for this should be self-evident to anyone who has read the preceding volumes of these memoirs. She requisitioned a strike force, not the largest she had ever commanded. She had learned long ago that precision was more effective than mass, but substantial. 2 platoons of inquisitorial stormtroopers. Her personal retinue, including several specialists whose skills I will not detail here for reasons of operational security. A Valkyrie wing for insertion. And because Amberly had always believed in being prepared, a Lemon Rust squadron on standby. She tracked the Orc warband to Calyx Roman 4 through a combination of Auspex data, astropathic intercepts, and the simple expedient of following the trail of destruction. Orcs, even blood axe commandos, are not difficult to track. They leave a wake of wreckage, noise, and outraged locals that even the most junior interrogator could follow. What she expected to find was an orc weirdboy attempting some form of psychic weaponization. What she found was considerably more complicated. and more wonderful, though she would never have used that word in an official report. Chapter 6. Surviving the Boys. I spent 3 days among the orcs of Gutsmash's warband. I do not recommend the experience, but I will concede that it was, in its own horrible way, educational. The key to surviving among orcs, I discovered, is that their social structure is simultaneously simpler and more nuanced than most Imperial observers assume. At its core, orc society operates on a single principle: strength commands respect. But strength encompasses more than mere physical power. It includes cunning, luck, and what the orcs call dead hardness, which is essentially a measure of how much punishment you can absorb and keep functioning. By their reckoning, a human who had been killed and come back was about as dead hard as it was possible to get. This meant that the boys treated me with something approaching reverence. Not deference. Orcs don't defer to anyone they haven't personally seen knock someone's teeth out, but a kind of fascinated respect, the way a connoisseur might regard a particularly fine vintage. They wanted to observe me, study me, understand what made the commissar so special. I, meanwhile, was studying them right back, while simultaneously trying to identify an escape route that didn't involve running through several hundred heavily armed greenskins who were specifically watching me. My first morning, if the word morning has any meaning in an orc camp, where the daily schedule consists of fighting, eating, fighting while eating, and sleeping, then fighting the orc who woke you up, I was given a tour by a boy called Grimjaw, who had apparently been assigned as my minder. Grimjaw was, by orc standards, positively philosophical. "See dat," he said, pointing to a pair of orcs beating each other with what appeared to be a vehicle axle and a large bone, respectively. "Dat's Skullcrack and Mogbad. Dey's been fightin' over dat axle since last week. Good fight, dat. Mogbad bit his ear off yesterday, but Skullcrack got it sewed back on by de pain boy, so now dey's even again." Fascinating, I said, and to my surprise, I meant it. There was a purity to orc conflict that was, in its own grotesque way, almost admirable. No politics, no hidden agendas, no backstabbing, or rather, plenty of backstabbing, but always in the literal, honest, right-in-front-of-you sense. When an orc wanted to kill you, he didn't file a report with the commissariat or arrange a tragic accident. He picked up the nearest heavy object and came straight at you, bellowing his intentions at the top of his considerable lungs. It was, I reflected, more honest than most of the imperial institutions I had served. This charitable thought lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was how long it took for Grimjaw to punch me in the shoulder in what he clearly intended as a friendly greeting, and which nearly dislocated the joint in question. "You's all right, Commissar," he declared, beaming, "for a humie." "Thank you," I wheezed, silently revising my opinion of orc society back to its factory settings. Amberly Vale's editorial note: Cain's observations about orc social dynamics, while characteristically framed as self-serving, are actually remarkably astute. Very few imperial observers have had the opportunity, or survived long enough, to study orc behavior from within a warband. His notes from this period have been classified and distributed to Ordo Zeno's field operatives as supplementary briefing material, though I have, of course, removed the more colorful editorial commentary. The days developed a surreal rhythm. I would wake, eat whatever was placed in front of me without looking at it too closely, and then navigate the social minefield of an orc camp with the careful precision of a man walking through a munitions dump with a lit candle. Every cowardly instinct, and I have a great many, whatever the official histories might claim, somehow produced exactly the opposite result from what I intended. When a knob threw a chopper at my head during an argument, not with me, I was merely in the vicinity, I ducked. The chopper embedded itself in the orc standing behind me, who went down like a felled grox. The surrounding boys erupted in appreciation. "Dead cunnin'," they declared. "Did you see dat? He ducked and let Grotznik take it instead. Dat's how the commissar fights." when a squig, one of the larger, more tooth-intensive varieties, broke loose from its pen and came barreling toward me, I did what any sensible person would do. I ran. I ran very fast. I ran in what I hoped was the direction of something the squig might find more interesting than me. As it happened, I ran directly past Gutsmash's prized squig-hound kennel, and the escaped squig, in its enthusiasm, crashed through the kennel fence and started fighting 6 of its occupants simultaneously. "De commissar was testin' de squig," Grimjo explained to the assembled crowd. "He ran past de kennel on purpose, to see how fast it was and den set it on de other squigs to see which was de toughest. Dat's tactical thinkin', dat is." I did not correct this interpretation. Perhaps most absurdly, my habit of hoarding food, a survival instinct honed by decades of campaign rations, and the certain knowledge that the next meal is never guaranteed, was interpreted as loot sense, which is apparently one of the most respected traits in orc culture. An orc who accumulates resources is an orc who's thinking ahead, and an orc who thinks ahead is an orc worth following. By the end of my second day, I had inadvertently become one of the most popular figures in the camp. Boys would approach me with a mixture of excitement and something I can only describe as orcish shyness, which manifests as standing uncomfortably close, breathing heavily, and saying things like, Commissar, is it true you killed a whole mob of boys with just a sword?" "A chain sword," I would correct, because accuracy costs nothing and because keeping them talking bought me more time to plan. "With a chain sword," they would repeat awed and then lope off to tell their mates, the story growing with each retelling until, by the time it reached the far side of the camp, I had apparently killed an entire wagog with a pointed stick. I spent the night studying the camp's layout, identifying patrol patterns, and mapping the surrounding terrain as best I could from ground level. The orcs were camped in the ruins of the refinery complex, which meant there was a great deal of cover but limited sightlines. The nearest Imperial-held territory was, by my best estimate, approximately 60 kilometers to the southeast, an impossible distance on foot through orc-controlled territory. I needed a distraction, a big one, and on the morning of my third day among the boys, I got one, though not in any form I would have chosen. Chapter 7: The Storm Breaks. The first sign was the sound, a distant, rhythmic thumping that I recognized instantly, because it was a sound that had preceded some of the best and worst moments of my career in roughly equal measure. Valkyrie engines, multiple contacts, coming in fast and low from the southeast. The second sign was the orcs' reaction. 500 greenskins stopped what they were doing, fighting while eating, and turned toward the sound with expressions of pure, undiluted joy. "Hummies," Grimjo roared, snatching up his choppa. "De hummies is air, wagog." "Wahog," the camp echoed, 500 voices merging into a wall of sound that made the air vibrate. Orcs stampeded toward their vehicles, their weapons, their positions, not with the disciplined urgency of Imperial soldiers responding to an alert, but with the gleeful abandon of children racing toward a promised treat. Gutsmasha appeared on the battlements of his fort, silhouetted against the gray sky, power claw raised. "This is it, boys. This is what we've been waiting for. The greatest fight ever, wag." I did not share the general enthusiasm. My feelings, as Valkyries screamed overhead and the first Lozbolts began to stitch across the camp perimeter, could best be described as determined to be elsewhere. The Imperial strike force had arrived, which meant rescue was theoretically possible. But between me and rescue was approximately 300 meters of open ground, a full-scale battle, and several hundred orcs who were currently too excited to remember that I was supposed to be on the other side. I ran, not toward the battle, Emperor forbid, but laterally, keeping to cover, ducking behind wrecked vehicles and collapsed structures, trying to work my way around the edge of the fighting to where the Imperial lines would be forming. The air was thick with smoke and the snap-crack of Law's fire. An orc truck roared past, close enough for me to feel the heat of its exhaust, its occupants howling war cries and hanging off every available surface. A stormtrooper hellgun beam sizzled over my head, close enough to singe hair I hadn't had 24 hours ago. I was halfway to the perimeter when I heard the machine. The resurrection mashing. It was active again. I could hear it, the whine of the plasma generators, the crackling of the WAG antenna, the unmistakable sound of Orc technology doing something that violated every known law of the universe. Green light spilled from the refinery's shattered windows, casting long shadows across the battlefield. And Boltscab's voice, carrying over the din with the excitement of a mech boy who had just had the worst idea of his life. If it works for one Hume, it'll work for anything. Let's bring back Gork, or maybe Mork, or both. Yeah, both. Wag. I stopped running. I want to be absolutely clear about my motivations here, because the official accounts, as usual, have painted them in colors considerably more heroic than they deserve. I did not turn back toward the refinery out of duty, or courage, or any noble impulse whatsoever. I turned back because I had fought orcs for over a century, and I knew with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has seen what the WAG field can do, that if Boltscab managed to pull even a fraction of a major orc deity's psychic imprint through that machine, the resulting entity would not only destroy the Imperial strike force, but quite possibly the entire planet. And I was on that planet. Self-preservation, pure and simple. The fact that it happened to align with the tactically correct decision was, as always, pure coincidence. Amberly Vale's editorial note, pure coincidence. Of course. Just as it was pure coincidence on Perlia, on Gravelax, on Adumbria, and on every other world where Cain's cowardice somehow produced exactly the result that a tactical genius would have engineered deliberately. I have learned, after decades of editing these memoirs, that arguing with Cain about his own motivations is an exercise in futility. I will simply note that a man driven purely by self-interest does not run toward a machine that is attempting to manifest an orc god. I reached the refinery at a dead sprint. Inside, Boltscab was hunched over the machine's controls, his mechanical arm a blur of adjustments. Zapchit, conscious again, barely, propped up by two Gretchen, was channeling power into the antenna with an expression of deranged ecstasy. The central chamber was pulsing with green light so intense it left afterimages, and something inside it was growing. Something large. Something that radiated a psychic pressure I could feel in my back teeth. I had no weapon. I had no plan. What I had was a lifetime of improvisation and a powerful desire not to be on the same continent as whatever was forming inside that chamber. There, the plasma generators, 6 of them linked in series feeding the machine. Each one was a looted Imperial unit, recognizable despite the orc modifications, and each one had a standard Imperial safety release, a manual override that would vent the plasma core in case of containment failure. The orcs hadn't removed them. Why would they? Safety was not an orc concept. I hit the first release. Superheated plasma vented sideways in a screaming jet that cut through 3 support cables and set a wall on fire. I hit the second, the third. The machine screamed a sound that was not entirely mechanical, as if something half-formed inside it was protesting its interrupted birth. Boltscab spun toward me, mechanical arm reconfiguring into something weapon-shaped. "Oi, what's you doing to my machine, ya?" I hit the 4th release. The plasma jet caught the WAG, antenna's base, and the entire spire began to topple. Boltscab abandoned his protest in favor of diving for cover. Zapchit, still channeling, couldn't stop the WAG. Energy had to go somewhere, and with the machine's containment failing, it went everywhere. The backlash was extraordinary. A shockwave of raw psychic energy, green, howling, tasting of rage and fungus and the distilled essence of several thousand years of orcish belligerence, erupted from the collapsing machine and rolled outward across the battlefield like a wall of emerald fire. It wasn't lethal. It was something arguably worse. It was disorienting. Every orc within a kilometer radius staggered, clutching their heads, as the psychic field that underpinned their collective consciousness flickered and stuttered like a faulty lumen. For approximately 30 seconds, the orcs of Gutsmash's warband forgot how to fight. Their guns stopped working, because they had only ever worked because the orcs believed they would. Their vehicles stalled. Their crude fortifications sagged as the psychic reinforcement that had been holding them together evaporated. 30 seconds, an eternity in combat, and the Imperial stormtroopers, who did not rely on psychic consensus for their weapons to function, exploited every one of them. I stumbled out of the refinery. I was covered in soot-green fluid and what I sincerely hoped was lubricant. My borrowed orc clothing was smoking. My hair, my new, young, resurrected hair, was singed. I looked, I imagine, like a man who had walked through the warp and come out the other side with a strongly worded complaint. I looked apparently like a hero. The stormtroopers saw me first, a lone human figure emerging from the heart of the orc camp, backlit by the burning refinery, striding toward Imperial lines with the kind of grim determination that makes for excellent propaganda posters. They didn't shoot me, which I appreciated. Then Amberly saw me. She was standing behind the stormtrooper line, directing operations with the controlled intensity I remembered so well. She was older, rejuvenate treatments slow the process, but they don't stop it entirely, but unmistakably herself. Her eyes met mine across the battlefield, and for a moment, the noise and the chaos and the burning orc camp faded to irrelevance. I raised a hand, a wave, a greeting, a gesture that was entirely inadequate for the circumstance but which was all I could manage, because if I tried to say anything, I was fairly certain my voice would do something deeply uncommissarial. She stared, for one heartbeat, two. Then, with the composure of an inquisitor who has seen stranger things than a dead man walking, though probably not by much, she turned to her adjutant and said, in a voice as level as a parade ground, "Have the Medici team stand by, and someone get the commissar a uniform." Amberly Vale's editorial note. My exact words, as I recall, were somewhat less composed than Cain's account suggests, but some things are not for official records. Chapter 8: The Debrief. The aftermath was, in many ways, more exhausting than the ordeal itself. I was extracted from the battlefield by stormtroopers who treated me with the kind of awed, gentle care usually reserved for newly discovered holy relics, which was, I suppose, essentially what I was. I was given a medical examination by a chirurgeon who kept pausing to stare at me, then at his Auspex readings, then back at me, with an expression that suggested his instruments were telling him things he didn't want to believe. I was, by every measurable standard, a perfectly healthy human male of approximately 30 standard years of age. I was also, by every available record, a man who had died of natural causes over a century ago. The chirurgeon's report, I later learned, concluded with, "Patient is in excellent physical health. Origin of patient remains theologically problematic." I was given a uniform, not my old one that, along with my sash and my reputation, presumably still hung in whatever was left of the Coriolis Roman 7 Scola, but a standard commissarial dress uniform that someone had procured with remarkable speed. It fit. It felt familiar in a way that was both comforting and slightly depressing, the way putting on armor feels to a soldier who had hoped his last battle was behind him. And then there was the debrief. A room, a table, Amberly on one side, flanked by two adjutants who were doing their best to pretend that this was a normal inquisitorial debriefing, and not the single most unusual event in their professional careers. Me on the other side, with a cup of Tana tea that someone, Amberly, I suspected, had ensured was waiting for me. The tea was perfect. She remembered how I took it. We discussed the orcs, the machine, The WAAG field mechanics, the strategic implications, the potential for replication, the necessary security classifications. It was professional, thorough, efficient. Everything an inquisitorial debrief should be. It was also, beneath the surface, something else entirely. There were pauses that lasted a fraction too long, glances that carried weight no adjutant could decode, a moment when our hands both reached for the same data slate and our fingers touched, and neither of us pulled away for a heartbeat longer than professional courtesy required. When the adjutants were dismissed, "I'll handle the remainder of the debrief personally," Amberly said, with the kind of calm authority that brokered no argument. We sat in silence for a long moment. "You look well," Amberly said finally, "for a dead man." "I feel well," I said, "for a dead man." Another pause. "The commissariat is going to have an absolute fit," she said. "The ecclesiarchy even more so. A resurrected hero of the Imperium doesn't fit neatly into anyone's bureaucratic categories." "I've never fitted neatly into anyone's categories," I said. "It's one of my more consistent qualities." She almost smiled, almost. "They're going to want you back, Ciaphas, active service. The Imperium is," she paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone accustomed to the weight of classified information, "in considerable difficulty. The Great Rift, the Indomitus Crusade, they need symbols, heroes. And you are the most famous hero the commissariat has ever produced." "I'm a fraud," I said reflexively. "The oldest lie, the most comfortable." "You're alive," she said. "That's what matters." And the way she said it, the way her voice softened on the last word, the way her eyes held mine with an intensity that had nothing to do with inquisitorial authority, told me everything that a century of death and an improbable resurrection had left unsaid. I drank my tea. It was, as I said, perfect. And I contemplated my future, which was, against all odds, a thing I had again. The Imperium would want its hero back. The commissariat would want its legend reactivated. The ecclesiarchy would want to argue about the theological implications for approximately the next 3 centuries. And somewhere out there, Warboss Gutsmasha, who had survived the battle, because orc warbosses always seemed to survive, was probably already planning round 2. I had died. I had come back. And the galaxy, that vast, uncaring, impossibly dangerous place, was going to demand that I do it all over again. Every duty, every battle, every moment of pure, screaming terror dressed up in a commissar's coat and mistaken for courage. I sighed. I finished my tea. I straightened my new uniform's collar. "Well," I said, to no one in particular, "I suppose it was too much to hope that death would be the one thing I wouldn't have to do twice." Amberly Vale's editorial note, and there it is, vintage Cain, dry, self-deprecating, and entirely missing the point. He had been given something that no one in the grim darkness of the far future is ever given, a second chance, and his first instinct was to complain about it. I find this, despite my best professional judgment, rather endearing. Whatever challenges the future holds, and there will be many, for the galaxy is no kinder in this millennium than it was in the last, I find myself cautiously optimistic. Certain reunions have a way of making even the darkest times seem, if not bright, then at least worth enduring. Author's note. The central conceit of this story, that the Orc Waag, Gestalt psychic field could be used to resurrect a dead human, is grounded in one of the most fascinating and well-established aspects of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The Waag field is the collective psychic emanation of orcoid species, and it demonstrably alters reality. Orc vehicles function despite having no logical reason to do so. Orc weapons fire without proper ammunition feeds. Red vehicles genuinely move faster because orcs believe they should. If collective orc belief can make a heap of scrap metal fly, the argument goes, then sufficiently focused belief, directed through a weird boy's psychic abilities, anchored by physical genetic material, and amplified by the collective memory of thousands of orcs who fought and feared a single individual, could, in theory, reconstitute that individual from the psychic imprint they left on the WAG field. It is a difference of scale, not of principle. The DNA anchor was a deliberate narrative choice to prevent the resurrection from feeling like pure hand-waving. Even in a universe where reality bends to collective belief, stories benefit from physical grounding. The genetic material serves as a template. The WAG field provides the energy and the memory of what Cain was, but the DNA provides the biological blueprint. It is the difference between a psychic projection and a physical reconstitution. The orcs didn't summon a ghost, they rebuilt a man, using his own genetic code as the scaffold and their collective memory as the architect. This also creates the narrative engine of the Skola heist, which is both a practical plot requirement and an opportunity for comedy. Maintaining Cain's characterization was the story's greatest challenge and its central pleasure. Cain's voice, that distinctive blend of false modesty, genuine perception, sardonic wit, and transparent self-interest, is the engine that drives every scene. The comedy of Cain has always been the gap between his self-image, coward, fraud, lucky survivor, and his actual behavior, competent, brave, consistently making the right choice under pressure. Every cowardly act in this story, ducking a blow, running from a squig, destroying the machine to reduce personal threats, produces a heroic outcome. This is not coincidence. It is the fundamental joke of the character, and it works because Cain himself never sees it. Finally, a note on canonicity. This story is set after Cain's canonical death of old age and exists in the speculative space that the lore leaves open. It contradicts no established events. Cain died, the Imperium mourned, and nothing in the existing canon addresses what might happen if an orc warband decided to bring him back. It is, in the best tradition of fan fiction, a story that plays in the margins, canon-adjacent, lore-respectful, and driven by the simple question that every fan of Ciaphas Cain has asked at least once: what if he came back?